The Victorian era was full of weird and not-so-wonderful jobs, many of them incredibly dangerous, and a lot of them now, thankfully, obsolete. And it wasn't just adults that worked, but children too. Child labour was a cruel reality of the 1800s. Not only did poor families need children to work to help with the family budget, but workhouses sent out orphan children to be employed in mills and factories or to find an apprenticeship to a trade in return for their keep. In a time when homes were heated by coal fires, chimney sweeps were essential for removing soot and ash from chimneys, both for safety and efficiency. Before the introduction of mechanical brushes, this was largely done with hand brushes and scrapers, but it was a job that was extremely hazardous to health, and whilst some chimney sweeps were paid well enough to live in relative comfort in return for the risks they faced, the majority were poor, working-class men, boys, and sometimes girls, working in a trade that often paid meagre wages. A climbing boy was a child chimney sweep, an apprentice to a master sweep, and used to access the narrow shafts of chimneys that an adult couldn't reach. The master sweep gained cheap labour, whilst the child gained dangerous work, the prospect of injury, and an untimely death. The life of a climbing boy was one of hard, physical work from early morning until late at night. Poor pay and the constant risk of burns, bruises, and broken bones, not to mention hacking coughs and eye irritation brought about by soot, ash, and noxious fumes. But the worst of all their fears was being trapped and suffocation. Growing recognition in the second half of the 18th century of harm to working children resulted in an Act of 1788 requiring that apprentices be at least 8 years of age, but the law was poorly enforced. It was not unknown for children as young as 4 years of age to be found working as climbing boys. A succession of laws passed in the early 1800s tightened control until an act in 1840 increased the minimum age to 16, but sweeps remained unlicensed until 1875, and the horror that child sweeps faced remained all too common in Victorian Britain. Today, you will discover the terrible plight of child chimney sweeps in the 1800s and hear how many were forced into this dangerous work, at best by poverty, being sold into an apprenticeship by their own parents, and at worst by being abducted on the streets, never to be seen again. This is told in a genuine account recorded by Henry Mayhew, a Victorian journalist. Mayhew's work is important, as he went to much trouble to describe the lives of London's everyday people in the 1840s and earlier. You will find out just how cruel and short the life of a climbing boy could be, with many facing a stark choice in life: climb chimneys and risk injury or death, or refuse and face the wrath of a brutal master. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us to continue bringing the past alive. Formerly, chimneys used to be cleansed by house servants, for a person could easily stand erect in the huge old-fashioned constructions and thrust up a broom as far as his strength would permit. Sometimes, however, straw was kindled at the mouth of the chimney, and in that way the soot was consumed or brought down to the ground by the action of the fire. As regards the first introduction of English children into chimneys, the establishment of the use of climbing boys, nothing appears, according to the representations made to Parliament on several occasions, to be known. A sweeper accompanied by a chummy, once a common name for the climbing boy being a corruption of chimney, was depicted on his way to a red brick house, from the chimneys of which bright yellow flames were streaming. Below was the detail of the things undertaken by the sweep, such as the extinction of fires in chimneys, the cleaning of smoke jacks, etc. A few of these signs, greatly faded, may be seen still. A sweeper who is settled in what is accounted a genteel neighbourhood, has now another way of making his calling known. He leaves a card whenever he hears of a newcomer, a tape being attached, so that it can be hung up in the kitchen, and thus the servants are always in possession of his address. Little attention seems to have been paid to the condition of these infants, until about 1780, when the benevolent Jonas Hanway, who is said, but not uncontradictably, to have been the first person who regularly used an umbrella in the streets of London, called public attention to the matter. In 1788, Mr. Hanway and others brought a bill into Parliament for the better protection of the climbing boys, requiring, among other provisions, all master sweepers to be licensed, and the names and ages of all their apprentices registered. The House of Lords, however, rejected this bill, and another bill of George III was passed in preference. The chief alterations sought to be effected by the new Act were that no sweeper should have more than 6 apprentices, and that no boy should be apprenticed at a tenderer age than 8 years. Previously, there were no restrictions in either of those respects. These provisions were, however, very generally violated by one of those flaws or omissions, so very common and so little creditable to our legislation. It was found that there was no prohibition to a sweeper's employing his own children at what age he pleased, and some, or several, for I find both words used, employed their sons and occasionally their daughters in chimney climbing at the ages of 6, 5, and even between 4 and 5 years. The children of others, too, were continually being apprenticed at illegal ages, for no inquiry was made into the lad's age beyond the statement of his parents, or, in the case of parish apprentices, beyond the, in those days, not more trustworthy word of the overseers. Thus boys of 6 were apprenticed, for apprenticeship was almost universal, as boys of 8 by their parents, whilst parish officers and magistrates consigned the workhouse orphans as a thing of course to the starvation and tyranny which they must have known were very often in store for them when apprenticed to sweepers. Mr. John Cook, a master sweeper, then of Great Windmill Street and Kentish Town, the first who persevered in the use of the machine years before its use was compulsory, stated that it was common for parents in the business to employ their own children under the age of 7 in climbing, and that as far as he knew, he himself was only between 6 and 7 when he came to it, and that almost all master sweepers had got in their bills that they kept small boys for register stoves, and such like as that. Mr. T. Allen, another master sweeper, was between 4 and 5 when articled to an uncle. Mr. B. M. Forster, a private gentleman, a member of the Committee to promote the superseding of climbing boys, said, "Some are put to the employment very young, one instance of which occurred to a child in the neighbourhood of Shoreditch, who was put to the trade at 4 1/4 years, or thereabouts. The father of a child in Whitechapel told me last week that his son began climbing when he was just 4 years and 8 months old. I have heard of some still younger, but only from vague report." This sufficiently proves at what infantine years children were exposed to toils of exceeding painfulness. The smaller and the more slenderly formed the child, the more valuable was he for the sweeping of flues, the interior of some of them to be ascended and swept, being but 7 inches square. Mr. B. M. Forster said, "Another circumstance which has not been mentioned to the committee is that there are several little girls employed. There are 2 of the name of Morgan at Windsor, daughters of the chimney sweeper, who is employed to sweep the chimneys of the castle. Another instance at Uxbridge, and at Brighton, and at Whitechapel, and at Headley near Barnet, and Witham in Essex, and elsewhere." He then stated, on being asked, "Do you think that girls were employed from their physical form being smaller and thinner than boys, and therefore could get up narrower flues?" "The reason that I have understood was because their parents had not a sufficient number of boys to bring up the business." Mr. Forster did not know the ages of these girls. The grievances I have spoken of were thus summed up by the Parliamentary Committee. It is in evidence that 1. They are stolen from, and sold by, their parents and inveigled out of workhouses. 2. That in order to conquer the natural repugnance of the infants to ascend the narrow and dangerous chimneys to clean which their labour is required, blows are used, that pins are forced into their feet by the boy that follows them up the chimney, in order to compel them to ascend it, and that lighted straw has been applied for that purpose. 3. That the children are subject to sores and bruises, and wounds and burns on their thighs, knees, and elbows, and that it will require many months before the extremities of the elbows and knees become sufficiently hard to resist the excoriations to which they are first subject. With regard to the stealing or kidnapping of children, for there was often a difficulty in procuring climbing boys, I find mention in the evidence as of a matter, but not a very frequent matter, of notoriety. One stolen child was sold to a master sweeper for £8 8 shillings. Mr. G. Reveley said, "I wish to state to the committee that case in particular, because it comes home to the better sort of persons in higher life. It seems that the child, upon being asked various questions, had been taken away. The child was questioned how he came into that situation. He said all that he could recollect was, as I heard it told at the time, that he and his sister, with another brother, were together somewhere, but he could not tell where. But not being able to run so well as the other two, he was caught by a woman and carried away and was sold, and came afterwards into the hands of a chimney sweeper. He was not afterwards restored to his family, and the mystery was never unravelled. But he was advertised, and a lady took charge of him. This child in 1804 was forced up a chimney at Bridlington in Yorkshire by a big boy, the younger boy being apparently but 4 years old. He fell and bruised his legs terribly against the grate. The Mrs. Auckland of Boynton, who had heard of the child and went to see him, became interested in his manners, and they took him home with them, the chimney sweeper, who perhaps got alarmed, being glad to part with him. Soon after he got to Boynton, the seat of Sir George Strickland, a plate with something to eat was brought to him. On seeing a silver fork he was quite delighted, and said Papa had such forks as those. He also said the carpet in the drawing-room was like Papa's. The housekeeper showed him a silver watch. He asked what sort it was. Papa's was a gold watch. He then pressed the handle and said, "Papa's watch rings. Why does not yours?" Sir George Strickland, on being told this circumstance, showed him a gold repeater. The little boy pressed the spring, and when it struck, he jumped about the room, saying, "Papa's watch rings so." At night, when he was going to bed, he said he could not go to bed until he had said his prayers. He then repeated the Lord's Prayer, almost perfectly. The account he gave of himself was that he was gathering flowers in his mamma's garden, and that the woman who sold him to the sweeper came in and asked him if he liked riding. He said yes, and she told him he should ride with her. She put him on a horse, after which they got into a vessel, and the sails were put up, and away they went. He had no recollection of his name or where he lived, and was too young to think his father could have any other name than that of Papa. He started whenever he heard a servant in the family at Boynton called George, and looked as if he expected to see somebody he knew. On inquiry, he said he had an uncle, George, whom he loved dearly. He says his mamma is dead, and it is thought his father may be abroad. From many things he says, he seems to have lived chiefly with an uncle and aunt, whom he invariably says were called Mr. and Mrs. Flemborough. From various circumstances, it is thought impossible he should be the child of the woman who sold him, his manners being very civilized, quite those of a child well educated. His dialect is good, and that of the south of England. This little boy, when first discovered, was conjectured to be about 4 years old, and is described as having beautiful black eyes and eyelashes, a high nose, and a delicate soft skin. Mr. J. Harding, a master sweeper, had a fellow apprentice who had been enticed away from his parents. It is a case of common occurrence, he said, for children stolen to be employed in this way. Yes, and children in particular are enticed out of workhouses. There are a great many who come out of workhouses. The following cases were also submitted to the committee. A poor woman had been obliged by sickness to go into a hospital, and while she was there her child was stolen from her house, taken into Staffordshire, and there apprenticed to a chimney sweeper. By some happy circumstance she learned his fate. She followed him and succeeded in rescuing him from his forlorn situation. Another child, who was an orphan, was tricked into following the same wretched employment by a chimney sweeper, who gave him a shilling, and made him believe that by receiving it he became his apprentice. The poor boy, either discovering or suspecting that he had been deceived, anxiously endeavoured to speak to a magistrate who happened to come to the house in which he was sweeping chimneys, but his master watched him so closely that he could not succeed. He at last contrived to tell his story to a blind soldier, who determined to right the poor boy, and by great exertions succeeded in procuring him his liberty. It was in country places, however, that the stealing and kidnapping of children was the most frequent, and the threat of "the sweeps will get you" was often held out to deter children from wandering. These stolen infants, it is stated, were usually conveyed to some distance by the vagrants who had secured them and sold to some master sweeper, being apprenticed as the child of the vendors, for it was difficult for sweepers in thinly peopled places to get a supply of climbing boys. It was shown about the time of the parliamentary inquiry, in the course of a trial at the Lancaster Assizes, that a boy had been apprenticed to a sweeper by two travelling tinkers, man and woman, who informed him that the child was stolen from another traveller 80 miles away, and was too fond of it to make it a sweep. The price of the child was not mentioned. Respecting the sale of children to be apprentices to sweepers, Mr. Tooke was able to state that, although in 1816 the practice had very much diminished of late, parents in many instances still sold their children for 3, 4, or 5 guineas. This sum was generally paid under the guise of an apprentice fee, but it was known to be and was called a sale, for the parents, real or nominal, never interfered with the master subsequently, but left the infant to its fate. I find the following account of the means resorted to in order to induce, or more frequently compel, these wretched infants to work. The boy in the first instance went for a month or any term agreed upon, on trial, or to see how he would fit for the business. During this period of probation he was usually well treated and well fed, whatever the character of the master, with little to do beyond running errands and observing the mode of work of the experienced climbers. When, however, he was bound as an apprentice, he was put with another lad who had been for some time at the business. The new boy was sent first up the chimney, and immediately followed by the other, who instructed him how to ascend. This was accomplished by the pressure of the knees and the elbows against the sides of the flue. By pressing the knees tightly, the child managed to raise his arms somewhat higher, and then by pressing his elbows in like manner, he contrived to draw up his legs, and so on. The inside of the flue presented a smooth surface, and there were no inequalities where the finger or toes could be inserted. Should the young beginner fall, he was sure to light on the shoulders of the boy beneath him, who always kept himself firmly fixed in expectation of such a mishap, and then the novice had to commence anew. In this manner the twain reached the top by degrees, sweeping down the soot, and descended by the same method. This practice was very severe, especially on new boys, whose knees and elbows were torn by the pressure and the slipping down continually, the skin being stripped off and frequently breaking out in frightful sores, from the constant abrasions and from the soot and dirt getting into them. In his evidence before Parliament in 1817, for there had been previous inquiries, Mr. Cook gave an account of the training of these boys, and on being asked, Do the elbows and knees of the boys, when they first begin the business, become very sore and afterwards get callous, and are those boys employed in sweeping chimneys during the soreness of those parts? Answered, it depends upon the sort of master they have got. Some are obliged to put them to work sooner than others. You must keep them a little at it, or they will never learn their business, even during the sores. He stated further that the skin broke generally, and that the boys could not ascend chimneys during the sores without very great pain. The way that I learn the boys is, he continued, to put some cloths over their elbows and over their knees till they get the nature of the chimney, till they get a little used to it. We call it padding them, and then we take them off, and they get very little grazed indeed after they have got the art. But very few will take that trouble. Some boys' flesh is far worse than others, and it takes more time to harden them. He was then asked, do those persons still continue to employ them to climb chimneys? And the answer was, some do. It depends upon the character of the master. None of them of that class keep them till they get well. None. They are obliged to climb with those sores upon them. I have never had one of my own apprentices do that. This system of padding, however, was but little practised, but in what proportion it was practised, unless by the respectable masters, who were then but few in number, the parliamentary papers, the only information on the subject now attainable, do not state. The inference is that the majority, out of but 20 of these masters, with some 80 or 100 apprentices, did treat them well, and what was so accounted. The customary way of training these boys, then, was such as I have described. Some even of the better masters, whose boys were in the comparison well lodged and fed, and sent to the Sunday school, which seems to have comprised all needful education, considered padding and such like to be newfangled nonsense. I may add also that although the boy carried up a brush with him, it was used but occasionally, only when there were turns or defects in the chimney, the soot being brought down by the action of the shoulders and limbs. The climber wore a cap to protect his eyes and mouth from the soot, and a sort of flannel tunic, his feet, legs, and arms being bare. Some of these lads were surprisingly quick. One man told me that, when in his prime as a climbing boy, he could reach the top of a chimney about as quickly as a person could go upstairs to the attics. The following is from the evidence of Mr. Cook, frequently cited as an excellent master. What mode do you adopt to get the boy to go up the chimney in the first instance? We persuade him as well as we can. We generally practice him in one of our own chimneys first. One of the boys who knows the trade goes up behind him, and when he has practised it perhaps 10 times, though some will require 20 times, they generally can manage it. The boy goes up with him to keep him from falling. After that, the boy will manage to go up with himself, after going up and down several times with one under him. We do this because if he happens to make a slip, he will be caught by the other. Do you find many boys show repugnance to go up first? Yes, most of them. And if they resist and reject, in what way do you force them up? By telling them we must take them back again to their father and mother, and give them up again, and their parents are generally people who cannot maintain them. So that they are afraid of going back to their parents for fear of being starved? Yes, they go through a deal of hardship before they come to our trade. Did you use any more violent means? Sometimes a rod. Did you ever hear of a straw being lighted under them? Never. You never heard of any means being made use of, except being beat and being sent home? No, no other. You are aware, of course, that those means being gentle or harsh must depend very much upon the character of the individual master. It does. Of course, you must know that there are persons of harsh and cruel disposition. Have you not often heard of masters treating their apprentices with great cruelty, particularly the little boys, in forcing them to go up those small flues, which the boys were unwilling to ascend? Yes, I have forced up many a one myself. By what means? By threatenings and by giving them a kick or a slap. It was also stated that the journeymen used the boys with greater cruelty than did the masters. Indeed, a delegated tyranny is often the worst, that for very little faults they kicked and slapped the children, and sometimes flogged them with a cat, made of rope, hard at each end and as thick as your thumb. Mr. John Fisher, a master chimney sweeper, said, Many masters are very severe with their children. To make them go up the chimneys, I have seen them make them strip themselves naked. I have been obliged myself to go up a chimney naked. As respects the cruelties of driving boys up chimneys by kindling straw beneath their feet, or thrusting pins into the soles of their feet, I find the following statements given on the authority of B.M. Forster, Esquire, a private gentleman residing in Walthamstow. A lad was ordered to sweep a chimney at Wandsworth. He came down after endeavouring to ascend, and this occurred several times before he gave up the point. At last the journeyman took some straw or hay and lighted it under him to drive him up. When he endeavoured to get up the last time, he found there was a bar across the chimney, which he could not pass. He was obliged, in consequence, to come down, and the journeyman beat him so cruelly, to use his own expression, that he could not stand for a fortnight. In the whole city of Norwich, I could find only 9 climbing boys, 2 of whom I questioned on many particulars. One was with respect to the manner in which they are taught to climb. They both agreed in that particular that a larger boy was sent up behind them to prick their feet if they did not climb properly. I purposely avoided mentioning about pricking them with pins, but asked them how they did it. They said that they thrust the pins into the soles of their feet. A third instance occurred at Walthamstow. A man told me that some he knew had been taught in the same way. I believe it to be common, but I cannot state any more instances from authority. On the subject of the sores, bruises, wounds, burns, and diseases to which chimney sweepers in their apprenticeships were not only exposed, but, as it were, condemned, Mr. R. Wright, a surgeon, on being examined before the committee, said, "I shall begin with deformity. I am well persuaded that the deformity of the spine, legs, arms, etc. of chimney sweepers generally, if not wholly, proceeds from the circumstance of their being obliged not only to go up chimneys at an age when their bones are in a soft and growing state, but likewise from their being compelled by their too merciless masters and mistresses to carry bags of soot, and those very frequently for a great length of distance and time, by far too heavy for their tender years and limbs. The knees and ankle joints mostly become deformed, in the first instance from the position they are obliged to put them in order to support themselves, not only while climbing up the chimney, but more particularly so in that of coming down, when they rest solely on the lower extremities. Sores, eyes, and eyelids are the next to be considered. Chimney sweepers are very subject to inflammation of the eyelids, and not unfrequently weakness of sight in consequence of such inflammation. This I attribute to the circumstance of the soot lodging on the eyelids, which first produces irritability of the part, and the constantly rubbing them with their dirty hands, instead of alleviating, increases the disease. For I have observed in a number of cases when the patient has ceased for a time to follow the business, and of course the original cause has been removed, that with washing and keeping clean they soon got well. Sores, for the same reason, are generally a long time in healing. Cancer is another and a most formidable disease, which chimney sweepers in particular are liable to, especially that of the scrotum, from which circumstances, by way of distinction, it is called the chimney sweeper's cancer. Of this sort of cancer I have seen several instances, some of which have been operated on, but in general they are apt to let them go too far before they apply for relief. Cancers of the lips are not so general as cancers of the scrotum. I never saw but 2 instances of the former, and several of the latter. The chimney sweep's cancer was also lectured upon as a separate disease at Guy's and Bartholomew's hospitals, and on the question being put to Mr. Wright, do the physicians who are entrusted with the care and management of those hospitals think that disease of such common occurrence that it is necessary to make it a part of surgical education? He replied, "Most assuredly. I remember Mr. Klein and Mr. Cooper were particular on that subject, and having 1 or 2 cases of the kind in the hospital, it struck my mind very forcibly. With the permission of the committee, I will relate a case that occurred lately, which I had from one of the pupils of St. Thomas's Hospital. He informed me that they recently had a case of a chimney sweeper's cancer, which was to have been operated on that week, but the man brushed, to use their expression, or rather walked off. He would not submit to the operation. Similar instances of which I have known myself. They dread so much the knife, in consequence of foolish persons telling them that it is so formidable an operation, and that they will die under it. I conceive, without the operation, it is death. For cancers are of that nature that unless you extricate them entirely, they will never be cured. Cough and asthma. Chimney sweepers are, from their being out at all hours and in all weathers, very liable to cough and inflammation of the chest. Burns, they are very subject to burns, from their being forced up chimneys while on fire, or soon after they have been on fire, and while overheated. And however they may cry out, their inhuman masters pay not the least attention, but compel them too often with horrid imprecations to proceed. Stunted growth in this unfortunate race of the community is attributed in a great measure to their being brought into the business at a very early age. To accidents, they were frequently liable in the pursuit of their callings, and sometimes these accidents were the being jammed or fixed, or, as it was called in the trade, stuck in narrow and heated flues, sometimes for hours, and until death. Among these hapless lads were indeed many deaths from accidents, cruelty, privation, and exhaustion, but it does not appear that the number was ever ascertained. There were also many narrow escapes from dreadful deaths. I give instances of each. On Monday morning, the 29th of March, 1813, a chimney sweeper of the name of Griggs attended to sweep a small chimney in the brewhouse of Messrs. Calvert and Company, in Upper Thames Street. He was accompanied by one of his boys, a lad of about 8 years of age, of the name of Thomas Pitt. The fire had been lighted as early as 2 o'clock the same morning, and was burning on the arrival of Griggs and his little boy at 8. The fireplace was small, and an iron pipe projected from the grate some little distance into the flue. This the master was acquainted with, having swept the chimneys in the brewhouse for some years, and therefore had a tile or two taken from the roof, in order that the boy might descend the chimney. He had no sooner extinguished the fire than he suffered the lad to go down, and the consequence, as might be expected, was his almost immediate death, in a state, no doubt, of inexpressible agony. The flue was of the narrowest description, and must have retained heat sufficient to have prevented the child's return to the top, even supposing he had not approached the pipe belonging to the grate, which must have been nearly red-hot. This, however, was not clearly ascertained on the inquest, though the appearance of the body would induce an opinion that he had been unavoidably pressed against the pipe. Soon after his descent, the master, who remained on the top, was apprehensive that something had happened, and therefore desired him to come up. The answer of the boy was, "I cannot come up, master. I must die here." An alarm was given in the brewhouse immediately that he had stuck in the chimney, and a bricklayer who was at work near the spot attended, and after knocking down part of the brickwork of the chimney just above the fireplace, made a hole sufficiently large to draw him through. A surgeon attended, but all attempts to restore life were ineffectual. On inspecting the body, various burns appeared. The fleshy part of the legs, and a great part of the feet more particularly, were injured. Those parts, too, by which climbing boys most effectually ascend or descend chimneys, the elbows and knees, seemed burnt to the bone, from which it must be evident that the unhappy sufferer made some attempts to return as soon as the horrors of his situation became apparent. In the improvement made some years since by the Bank of England in Lothbury, a chimney belonging to a Mr. Mildrum, a baker, was taken down, but before he began to bake, in order to see that the rest of the flue was clear, a boy was sent up, and after remaining some time, and not answering to the call of his master, another boy was ordered to descend from the top of the flue and to meet him halfway. But this being found impracticable, they opened the brickwork in the lower part of the flue, and found the first-mentioned boy dead. In the meantime, the boy in the upper part of the flue called out for relief, saying he was completely jammed in the rubbish and was unable to extricate himself. Upon this a bricklayer was employed with the utmost expedition, but he succeeded only in obtaining a lifeless body. The bodies were sent to St. Margaret's Church, Lothbury, and a coroner's inquest, which sat upon them, returned the verdict, accidental death. In the beginning of the year 1808, a chimney sweeper's boy being employed to sweep a chimney in Marsh Street, Walthamstow, in the house of Mr. Geoffrey, a carpenter, unfortunately in his attempts to get down, stuck in the flue and was unable to extricate himself. Mr. Geoffrey, being within hearing of the boy, immediately procured assistance. As the chimney was low and the top of it easily accessible from without, the boy was taken out in about 10 minutes. The chimney pot and several rows of bricks having been previously removed. If he had remained in that dreadful situation many minutes longer, he must have died. His master was sent for, and he arrived soon after the boy had been released. He abused him for the accident, and, after striking him, sent him with a bag of soot to sweep another chimney. The child appeared so very weak when taken out that he could scarcely stand, and yet this wretched being, who had been up ever since 3 o'clock, had before been sent by his master to Wanstead, which with his walk to Marsh Street made about 5 miles. On one occasion a child remained above 2 hours in some danger in a chimney. Rather than venture down and encounter his master's anger, the man was held to bail, which he could not procure. As in the cases I have described, at Messrs. Calvert and in Lothbury, the verdict was usually accidental death, or something equivalent. It was otherwise, however, where willful cruelty was proven. The following case was a subject of frequent comment at the time. On Friday, 31st of May, 1816, William Moles and Sarah, his wife, were tried at the Old Bailey for the wilful murder of John Hewley, alias Haseley, a boy about 6 years of age, in the month of April last, by cruelly beating him. Under the direction of the learned judge, they were acquitted of the crime of murder, but the husband was detained to take his trial as for a misdemeanour, of which he was convicted upon the fullest evidence, and sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment. The facts, as proved in the case, are too shocking in detail to relate. The substance of them is that he was forced up the chimney on the shoulder of a bigger boy, and afterwards violently pulled down again by the leg and dashed upon a marble hearth. His leg was thus broken, and death ensued in a few hours, and on his body and knees were found scars arising from wounds of a much older date. This long-continued system of cruelties, of violations of public and private duties, bore and ripened its natural fruits. The climbing boys grew up to be unhealthy, vicious, ignorant, and idle men, for during their apprenticeships their labour was over early in the day, and they often passed away their leisure in gambling in the streets with one another and other children of their stamp, as they frequently had halfpence given to them. They played also at chuck and toss with the journeymen, and of course were stripped of every farthing. Thus they became indolent and fond of excitement. When a lad ceased to be an apprentice, although he might be but 16, he was too big to climb, and even if he got employment as a journeyman, his remuneration was wretched, only 2 shillings a week, with his board and lodging. Of the condition and lot of the operatives who were too big to go up chimneys, Mr. J. Fisher, a master sweeper, gave the following account. They get into a roving way, and go about from one master to another, and they often come to no good end at last. The effect of the roving habit of the large boys, when they become too large to climb, is that they get one with another and learn bad habits from one another. They never will stop long in only one place. They frequently go into the country and get various places. Perhaps they stop a month at each. Some try to get masters themselves, and some will get into bad company, which very often happens. Then they turn thieves. They get lazy. They won't work, and people do not like to employ them lest they should take anything out of their houses. The generality of them never settle in any steady business. They generally turn loose characters, and people will not employ them, lest they should take anything out of the house.